Jake Morrison sat in the corner of the smoky cantina on Kepler 7 mining station and watched the alien crowd through tired eyes. The drink in his hand was his third of the night, but he barely tasted it. 5 years had passed since he left the Earth Defense Force, and those 5 years felt like 50. The Galactic Council had made their feelings about humans very clear when they banned human military units from peacekeeping operations. Too aggressive, they said. Too unpredictable. Too dangerous. The irony was not lost on Jake that the same traits that made humans unwelcome in official military service made them highly sought after in the mercenary trade. He had built a solid reputation working solo contracts across 12 star systems. When other species needed someone to handle problems that regular military forces could not solve, they called humans. When they needed those same problems to disappear, quietly and permanently, they called Jake Morrison specifically. Tonight felt different, though. The usual crowd of traders and miners gave him more space than normal. Word traveled fast in the outer systems, and his last job on Rigel 4 had made quite an impression. Taking down an entire pirate operation single-handed would do that. The pirates had expected a standard military response with predictable tactics and overwhelming force. Instead, they got one very angry human with a grudge and a complete disregard for conventional strategy. Nervous Zephyrian approached his table, carrying a datapad in his 3-fingered hands. Zephyrians were known for their caution, so seeing one seek out a human mercenary in a place like this meant serious business. The alien skin had that pale blue tint that indicated extreme stress, and his large eyes kept darting around the room as if expecting trouble. Jake gestured to the empty chair across from him without looking up from his drink. The Zephyrian sat down quickly and placed the datapad on the scarred metal table between them. His name was Crix, and he represented a coalition of off-world groups that Jake had never heard of. That alone was interesting since Jake made it his business to know every major player in the mercenary trade. The contract details made Jake sit up and pay attention. Vortonia Prime was a planet under Sarkonian control, and the Sarkonians were strip mining sacred burial grounds belonging to the native Vorthic people. The Galactic Council had refused to intervene despite multiple appeals from various humanitarian groups. Sarkonian political influence ran deep in council chambers, and their military was considered one of the most powerful in the galaxy. The proposed mission made Jake laugh out loud. Infiltrate a heavily fortified planet with 50,000 enemy troops, disable their mining operations, force them to abandon their claim, and leave the planet. Do all of this alone with no official support and no backup. The Zephyrian winced at Jake's laughter, but continued explaining the terms, that the fee was substantial enough to buy Jake his own ship and set him up for a comfortable retirement. But money was not what caught his attention. Every military strategist in known space had declared Vortania Prime impossible to take with anything less than a full fleet assault. The Sarkonian defensive network was considered the gold standard for planetary fortification. Their troops were seasoned veterans with advanced equipment and rigid discipline. Jake studied the planetary scans and troop deployment data that Crix had provided. 50,000 Sarkonians with orbital defense platforms and patrol fleets. Automated weapon systems covering every major approach vector. Command bunkers built into mountain faces with enough firepower to level cities. On paper, it looked hopeless, and Jake understood why no one else had taken the contract. But Jake had learned something during his years in the defense force that most military planners seemed to forget. Rigid systems had predictable weaknesses. Advanced equipment often meant complex failure points. Seasoned veterans sometimes became too comfortable with established patterns. And large numbers of troops required massive logistical support that created vulnerable supply lines. More importantly, Jake had something that no Sarkonian military planner would expect or know how to counter. He had human unpredictability and 5 years of experience, proving that impossible missions just required unconventional thinking. While other species approached warfare with established doctrines and predictable strategies, humans threw out the rulebook and made up new rules as they went along. The Zephyrian was sweating now, despite the cool air in the cantina. He obviously expected Jake to laugh again or walk away from what amounted to a suicide mission. Instead, Jake drained his glass and picked up the data pad to review the contract terms more carefully. The mission parameters were broad enough to give him complete tactical freedom. No oversight, no restrictions on methods. Complete operational autonomy. Jake signed the contract with a grin that made the Zephyrian lean back in his chair. 50,000 Sarkonian troops thought they were safe behind their walls and weapons. They were about to learn what happened when one very determined human decided their safety was an illusion. The galaxy was full of species that had forgotten the first rule of dealing with humans. Never assume something is impossible just because it has never been done before. Crix transferred half the payment immediately and promised the rest upon successful completion. Jake pocketed the credit chip and started making mental notes about equipment and supplies. He had 3 weeks to plan and prepare before the transport to Vortania Prime departed. 3 weeks to figure out how to do the impossible and make it look easy. Jake spent the next 3 weeks buried in research and preparation. The cantina on Kepler 7 became his temporary office as he gathered every scrap of intelligence about Vortania Prime and its Sarkonian occupiers. His network of contacts across the galaxy proved invaluable as information flowed in from traders, smugglers, and former military personnel who had encountered Sarkonian forces. The planet itself was roughly Earth-sized with 3 major continents and a single large ocean. The Sarkonians had established their primary base on the central continent where the richest crystal deposits were located. Their mining operations stretched across hundreds of square kilometers and employed both automated equipment and slave labor from the native Vorthic population. Orbital defense platforms protected the planet while patrol ships maintained constant sweeps of the surrounding space. Sarkonian military doctrine fascinated Jake as he studied their tactical manuals and battle reports. They were a proud warrior species that valued discipline and hierarchy above all else. Their units moved in precise formations and followed established protocols regardless of changing battlefield conditions. This rigid adherence to doctrine made them predictable, but also gave them tremendous staying power in conventional warfare. Jake identified patterns in their patrol schedules and noted that Sarkonian commanders preferred to establish fortified positions and force enemies to attack prepared defenses. They excelled at defensive warfare, but seemed less comfortable with rapid tactical changes or unconventional threats. Their equipment was top quality, but standardized across all units, which meant they had fewer backup systems when things went wrong. The communication networks showed interesting vulnerabilities. Sarkonians used encrypted channels that changed frequencies every 6 hours according to predetermined schedules. The encryption was military grade, but the frequency patterns followed mathematical sequences that Jake could predict once he understood the underlying algorithm. More importantly, their backup communication systems relied on physical relay stations that could be targeted individually. Jake made contact with Marcus Webb, a black market arms dealer operating out of the Tau Ceti system. Marcus specialized in acquiring military hardware that had fallen off official inventory lists, and his prices were reasonable for quality merchandise. Jake purchased a selection of Earth-manufactured weapons that Sarkonian forces had never encountered, including plasma rifles with non-standard energy signatures and explosive compounds with chemical markers that would not register on typical Sarkonian sensors. The most important acquisition was information about Sarkonian psychology and culture. Jake spent hours studying their social hierarchy and learned that individual Sarkonians placed enormous value on personal honor and combat prowess. They viewed warfare as a test of worthiness and preferred direct confrontation to subtle tactics. This cultural bias would work against them when facing an opponent who refused to fight by their rules. Transport to Vortania Prime came courtesy of a freight captain named Betty Chun, who owed Jake a favor from a previous job. Her ship, the Lucky Strike, regularly delivered mining supplies to Sarkonian installations and had established credentials that would pass orbital inspection. Jake hid himself among legitimate cargo containers filled with replacement drill bits and mining explosives. The irony of smuggling weapons inside shipments of mining equipment was not lost on him. The journey to Vortania Prime took 8 days through hyperspace, and Jake used the time to finalize his operational plans. He had studied the planetary geography extensively and identified a landing zone in the mountainous northern region that offered good concealment and multiple escape routes. The area was far enough from major Sarkonian installations to avoid immediate detection, but close enough to allow observation of their activities. Betty executed the insertion flawlessly during a routine supply run to the main mining facility. While Sarkonian inspectors checked manifest documents and scanned cargo containers, Jake slipped out through a hidden compartment and disappeared into the rocky terrain surrounding the landing pad. His equipment pack contained enough supplies for 2 weeks of independent operation plus specialized gear for surveillance and sabotage missions. The first priority was establishing a secure base camp where Jake could operate without detection. He located a natural cave system approximately 20 kilometers from the main Sarkonian base that offered concealment and fresh water. The caves had been used by native Vorthic as shelter during seasonal storms and showed no signs of recent Sarkonian activity. Jake set up his equipment and began systematic observation of enemy operations. Sarkonian activity patterns became clear within days of observation. Their mining operations ran around the clock, with 3 distinct shifts that changed every 8 hours. Supply convoys arrived twice weekly on predetermined schedules carrying food, equipment, and replacement personnel. Patrol routes covered all major approaches to the mining facility, but left gaps in the mountainous terrain that careful movement could exploit. The most revealing discovery was how comfortable the Sarkonians had become in their position. 5 years of unopposed occupation had bred complacency in their security procedures. Guards followed routine patterns without variation and surveillance equipment operated on automatic cycles that could be timed and avoided. They had grown confident that no significant threat could reach them. On their heavily fortified planet. Jake observed their command structure and identified key personnel through careful study of movement patterns and communication intercepts. General Vex Therian commanded the entire planetary operation from a fortified complex built into the mountainside. His subordinate commanders maintained regular schedules and predictable habits that made them vulnerable to targeted operations. Indigenous Vorthic people presented both an opportunity and a complication. They had been enslaved by the Sarkonians, but maintained their own cultural identity and social structure. Some worked in the mines under armed guard, while others had been relocated to containment camps near the main base. Their resentment toward their occupiers was obvious, but they lacked the resources or organization to mount effective resistance. After a week of observation, Jake had mapped Sarkonian defensive positions, identified critical infrastructure nodes, and developed a comprehensive understanding of their operational procedures. The enemy was strong and well-equipped, but they had grown predictable in their strength. They expected threats to come from space or through conventional military assault. They were not prepared for a single human operating alone with complete tactical freedom and no regard for conventional military doctrine. Jake settled into his cave base and began final preparations for active operations. Phase 1 would focus on psychological warfare, designed to shake Sarkonian confidence and create uncertainty in their ranks. Phase 2 would target critical infrastructure to disrupt their operations and communications. Phase 3 would force them into a position where withdrawal became their only viable option. The Sarkonians thought their planet was impregnable because no one had ever successfully challenged their control. They were about to discover that human definitions of impossible were quite different from everyone else's. Jake began his campaign against the Sarkonians with moves so subtle that the enemy did not even realize they were under attack. His first target was the automated mining equipment that operated continuously in the crystal fields. During the night shift, when fewer guards were present, Jake slipped past perimeter sensors and accessed the programming interface on several drill units. Instead of disabling them completely, he made small adjustments to their operating parameters that would cause equipment failures over the following days. The beauty of this approach was that mechanical breakdowns were common in mining operations, and the Sarkonians would initially blame poor maintenance or equipment age rather than sabotage. Jake introduced random delays in drilling sequences, altered depth measurements to cause drill bits to break on hard rock, and modified sensor readings to make the equipment report false mineral concentrations. The cumulative effect would be significant operational disruption without obvious signs of enemy action. His next targets were supply convoys traveling between the main base and outlying facilities. Jake studied convoy routes and identified several locations where trucks passed through narrow valleys with limited visibility. He did not attack the convoys directly, but instead replaced their cargo with harmless substitutes. Food shipments arrived containing native fruits that looked similar to standard rations, but tasted completely different. Equipment deliveries contained perfectly functional tools that had been swapped for slightly different models that would confuse maintenance crews. The psychological impact of these incidents was exactly what Jake intended. Sarkonian troops began questioning the reliability of their supply chain and wondering if someone was playing elaborate pranks on them. The incidents were too numerous to be accidents, but too harmless to indicate serious sabotage. This created uncertainty and paranoia in the ranks as soldiers wondered what would go wrong next. Jake escalated his psychological warfare by targeting communication systems. He had studied Sarkonian encryption protocols and discovered that their backup channels used older security codes that he could break with sufficient time and computing power. Using portable equipment from his cave base, Jake intercepted routine military communications and replaced them with modified versions that contained subtle errors and contradictions. Weather reports were altered to predict storms that never came. Duty rosters were changed to create scheduling conflicts that left some positions unmanned while others were double-staffed. Supply requests were modified to order ridiculous quantities of unnecessary items while reducing orders for essential materials. Each change was small enough to seem like a clerical error, but the cumulative effect created chaos in Sarkonian administrative procedures. The most effective psychological tool was Jake's calling card system. After each successful infiltration, he left behind a small Earth flag and a handwritten note in perfect Sarkonian script that read simply, "One human did this." The notes were placed in locations that should have been secure, making it clear that their mysterious enemy could go anywhere and do anything without being detected. General Tharian received his first report of the incidents after a week of systematic harassment. Equipment failures had reduced mining output by 15%, while supply problems were causing shortages of basic necessities. The calling cards made it obvious that these were not random accidents, but the work of a single infiltrator who seemed to know their procedures better than they did themselves. Jake observed increased security patrols and random inspections as The Sarkonians tried to identify their elusive enemy. He used their heightened alertness against them by timing his movements to avoid detection while creating false trails that led nowhere. Security cameras occasionally captured blurred images of a figure moving through restricted areas, but never provided clear identification or indicated how the infiltrator had bypassed multiple security checkpoints. The psychological pressure intensified when Jake began targeting individual officers with personalized harassment. He studied their daily routines and personal habits through careful observation and communication intercepts. Commander Zex Corlin always inspected the main gate at precisely 800 hours, so Jake arranged for the guard post computer to play ancient human war songs instead of displaying security feeds. Major Vel Draxon maintained a private office where he kept trophies from previous campaigns, so Jake rearranged the display to spell out human in Sarkonian script. These personal touches had tremendous psychological impact because they demonstrated intimate knowledge of individual officers and their habits. The enemy was not just attacking their installation, but studying them personally and invading their private spaces. Sarkonian warriors prided themselves on being alert and dangerous, but someone was making them look foolish without even revealing himself. Jake also targeted the Vorthic slave population, but in a completely different way. Instead of harassment, he left small gifts and messages of hope. Food packages appeared in slave quarters with notes explaining that help was coming. Work tools were secretly sharpened or repaired to make difficult tasks easier. These acts of kindness served multiple purposes by building goodwill among potential allies while demonstrating to the Sarkonians that their control over the native population was not absolute. After 2 weeks of psychological warfare, Jake could see the effects on Sarkonian morale through his observations of their daily activities. Guard posts maintained heightened alert status that exhausted troops and made them jumpy. Officers held more frequent meetings to discuss security concerns and countermeasures. Routine operations took longer to complete as personnel double-checked everything for signs of sabotage. The most telling sign was how Sarkonian troops had begun looking over their shoulders and questioning normal activities. When a drill broke down, they wondered if it was sabotage. When a communication failed, they suspected enemy interference. When food tasted different, they worried it might be poisoned. The unknown enemy had become a constant presence in their thoughts and conversations. General Therion increased security measures and instituted random searches of all personnel and facilities. He brought in technical specialists to analyze the calling cards and handwriting samples, but found no useful information. The notes were written with standard materials available anywhere in the galaxy and contained no identifying characteristics beyond perfect Sarkonian grammar and handwriting. Jake watched these developments with satisfaction from his hidden cave. Phase 1 of his campaign was succeeding beyond expectations. The Sarkonians were frightened and confused by an enemy they could not identify or locate. Their rigid military doctrine provided no guidance for dealing with an opponent who refused to fight conventionally. More importantly, their confidence in their own security had been shattered by repeated demonstrations that their defenses were meaningless against someone who understood their weaknesses. Psychological foundation was now in place for Jake to begin Phase 2 of his operation. The Sarkonians were expecting an escalation, but they had no idea what form it would take. Jake intended to keep them guessing while he systematically dismantled the infrastructure that kept their occupation functioning. Jake had identified 3 critical systems that kept the Sarkonian occupation functioning and decided the time had come to move beyond psychological warfare to direct action. The primary mining facility processed all extracted crystals and coordinated automated equipment across the planet. The orbital communication relay maintained contact with Sarkonian command and coordinated defensive operations. The main power generation plant provided energy for the entire military installation. Each target represented a different type of challenge that would test different aspects of Jake's training and experience. The mining facility presented the most complex infiltration challenge because it operated continuously with multiple security checkpoints and overlapping sensor coverage. Jake spent 3 days studying guard rotations and equipment patterns before identifying a narrow window during shift changes. When personnel movement created brief gaps in surveillance, he would have exactly 4 minutes to penetrate the facility, complete his mission, and escape without triggering any alarms. Jake approached the facility during a fierce windstorm that provided natural cover and interfered with motion sensors. He had studied Sarkonian equipment specifications and knew their detection systems had difficulty distinguishing between small moving objects and windblown debris during severe weather. Using climbing gear and magnetic grips, he scaled the outer wall and accessed a maintenance hatch that led directly into the processing center. The facility's central computer-controlled automated mining equipment across the entire planet through quantum-encrypted channels. Jake could not break the encryption, but he did not need to because he had something better. During his reconnaissance, he had obtained technical manuals for the processing software and discovered that it included a diagnostic mode for testing equipment functionality. By accessing diagnostic controls, Jake could reprogram the automated systems without triggering security protocols. Instead of destroying the mining equipment, Jake reprogrammed it to extract worthless rock while displaying normal operational readings. To supervisory personnel, the drilling units would continue working at full capacity, but they would be bringing up common stone and dirt instead of valuable crystals. The processing computers would report normal mineral concentrations and shipment schedules while actually producing containers full of useless debris. Jake completed the reprogramming with 30 seconds to spare and exited through the same maintenance hatch he had used for entry. The entire operation took less than 4 minutes and left no obvious signs that anyone had been inside the facility. Sarkonian security teams would find nothing unusual during their next inspection, and the sabotage would not become apparent until processed materials reached quality control stations several days later. The orbital communication relay required a completely different approach because it was located on a mountain peak, surrounded by automated defense systems and staffed around the clock by communication specialists. Direct assault was impossible, and stealth infiltration would be extremely difficult given the limited approach routes and high-tech surveillance equipment protecting the installation. Jake decided to use the planet's natural electrical storms as both cover and a weapon. Weather monitoring data showed that severe thunderstorms occurred regularly in the mountainous region where the relay was located. During electrical storms, the Sarkonians shut down sensitive equipment and relied on backup systems to avoid damage from power surges and electromagnetic interference. Jake waited for the next major storm and began his approach during the worst phase when lightning strikes were occurring every few seconds. The electromagnetic pulses from lightning strikes overwhelmed Sarkonian sensors and made electronic surveillance nearly impossible. Jake climbed the mountain during the height of the storm, using insulated equipment and rubber-soled boots to protect himself from electrical discharge. The communication relay was protected by an electromagnetic shield that deflected lightning strikes, but Jake had prepared for this obstacle. Using components salvaged from mining equipment, he had built a device that could channel and focus electromagnetic energy from lightning strikes. When properly positioned, the device would create an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to overwhelm the relay's protective systems. Jake reached the relay installation during a brief lull in the storm and quickly installed his device on the main power coupling. When the next lightning strike hit the mountain, his device channeled the electrical energy directly into the relay's internal systems. The resulting electromagnetic pulse not only destroyed the communication equipment, but cascaded through connected systems and disabled defensive grids across 3 sectors of the planetary defense network. The power plant presented the greatest personal risk because it was located within the main Sarkonian military complex and surrounded by multiple layers of security. Guards patrolled the perimeter constantly, while automated systems monitored every access point. Motion sensors covered all approaches, and thermal imaging would detect any attempt at stealth infiltration. Jake realized that the most heavily guarded target might actually be the easiest to penetrate if he abandoned stealth in favor of audacity. Sarkonian security was designed to prevent infiltration by detecting and stopping intruders. But what if the intruder did not try to hide and instead walked through the front entrance with apparent authorization, using intelligence gathered during his reconnaissance? Jake had learned the identity and daily routine of Colonel Rex Valanx, who supervised power plant operations. Jake studied security footage of the Colonel and practiced mimicking his posture and movement patterns. He acquired a Sarkonian uniform through careful theft and created false identification documents using equipment from his base camp. Appointed day, Jake approached the power plant main entrance during the morning shift change when personnel movement was at its peak. He wore the stolen uniform and carried forged credentials, identifying him as Colonel Valanx, arriving for an unscheduled inspection. His human appearance would normally have triggered immediate suspicion, but Jake was counting on Sarkonian psychology working in his favor. Sarkonian military culture emphasized rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience to superior officers. Guards were trained to respond instantly to commands from higher-ranking personnel without questioning orders or credentials. More importantly, Jake had observed that Sarkonians had difficulty distinguishing between different alien species, might not immediately recognize that he was human rather than some other non-Sarkonian officer. The deception worked perfectly, as guards snapped to attention and admitted him without question. Jake maintained his authoritative demeanor and proceeded directly to the power plant control center as if he belonged there. Technical personnel assumed he was conducting a legitimate inspection and answered his questions about system operations. Without suspicion, Jake accessed the main power grid through a administrative terminal and introduced a sophisticated virus that would gradually reduce power output while reporting normal operational status to monitoring systems. The virus was designed to spread slowly through connected systems and create cascading failures that would appear to be random equipment malfunctions rather than sabotage. The entire infiltration took less than an hour, and Jake exited through the same main entrance he had used for entry. Guards saluted respectfully as he left, and no one questioned his presence or activities. Within days, the virus would begin affecting power generation and distribution throughout the Sarkonian installation. But by then, Jake would be safely back at his cave base, planning the next phase of his campaign. All 3 strikes were successful beyond Jake's expectations. Mining output dropped to near zero as automated equipment brought up worthless rock instead of valuable crystals. Communication with Orbital Command became intermittent as backup systems struggled to compensate for the destroyed relay. Rolling blackouts began affecting different sections of the military complex as power generation gradually decreased. The cumulative effect was exactly what Jake had intended. Sarkonian operations were being systematically disrupted, while their ability to coordinate responses was severely limited. General Therian was receiving reports of multiple critical failures, but had no way to determine if they were related or how to prevent further problems. Jake watched Sarkonian activity from his hidden observation posts and noted increased patrols and security sweeps as they searched desperately for their elusive enemy. But they were looking for conventional threats and had no idea that one human with determination and creativity could cause so much damage to their supposedly impregnable installation. General Vex Therian stared at the reports covering his desk and felt his carefully controlled military composure beginning to crack. 3 weeks of systematic failures had reduced his planetary operation to near chaos. Mining output had dropped to almost nothing. Communication with Fleet Command was intermittent at best. Power failures were affecting critical systems throughout the installation. Most disturbing of all was that his security forces had found no trace of the enemy responsible for this campaign of sabotage. Tharian's response was predictable, given Sarkonian military doctrine, and Jake had been counting on exactly this reaction. Unable to locate his real enemy, the general declared martial law and began conducting brutal interrogations of the native Vorthic population. Sarkonian troops rounded up suspected collaborators and subjected them to harsh questioning about human infiltrators and resistance activities. Jake observed these developments with satisfaction from his hidden surveillance posts. The interrogations were producing exactly the reaction he had hoped for. The Vorthic people were innocent of any involvement in his campaign, but Sarkonian brutality was turning them from passive victims into active enemies of the occupation. More importantly, the interrogations were being recorded by automated security systems that Jake could access and broadcast throughout the galaxy. The time had come for the final phase of Jake's operation. Everything he had done up to this point had been preparation for a single decisive action that would end Sarkonian control of Vortania Prime permanently. Jake had studied Sarkonian culture extensively and understood that their warrior society valued personal combat above all other forms of conflict resolution. Honor and individual prowess were central to their identity as a species. Activated every communication system on the planet simultaneously and began broadcasting on all frequencies. His message was simple and direct. He identified himself as the human responsible for the recent campaign against Sarkonian forces and issued a formal challenge that no warrior culture could ignore. Single combat between himself and their best fighter, with the planet's future hanging in the balance. If he won, the Sarkonians would leave Vortania Prime forever. If he lost, he would surrender himself for execution. The broadcast reached Sarkonian installations across the planet within minutes and was automatically relayed to Fleet Command through surviving communication links. Jake had positioned himself on top of the largest Sarkonian fortress while making the transmission, so there could be no doubt about his location or intentions. He stood in plain sight, wearing standard Earth military gear and carrying weapons that were obviously human in origin. General Tharian's first reaction was disbelief that one human could be responsible for everything that had happened. But the evidence was overwhelming as Jake recounted specific details of each sabotage operation that only the perpetrator could have known. The psychological impact on Sarkonian troops was immediate and devastating as they realized they had been outfought by a single enemy operating alone. The challenge created a dilemma for Tharian, because Sarkonian honor codes made it impossible to refuse without admitting cowardice. At the same time, accepting the challenge meant risking the entire planetary operation on the outcome of personal combat. But Jake had anticipated this hesitation and sweetened the terms by broadcasting his challenge throughout the galaxy using hijacked communication networks. Within hours, the challenge was being discussed on news networks across dozens of star systems. Betting pools formed on multiple worlds with odds heavily favoring the Sarkonians, given their reputation as fierce warriors. The galactic audience made it impossible for Tharian to refuse the challenge without losing face throughout known space. Sarkonian pride demanded that they prove their superiority over this upstart human. Tharian selected Commander Krex Dolan as his champion. Dolan was a veteran of 30 campaigns who stood 8 feet tall and had never lost in personal combat. His reputation for brutality was legendary even among Sarkonians, and he had killed opponents from a dozen different species. If anyone could crush this human pretender, it would be Dolan. Jake had expected this choice because his intelligence gathering had identified Dolan as the most skilled fighter in the Sarkonian forces. More importantly, Jake had studied security. Footage of Doolin's previous fights and knew exactly what to expect. The commander was a traditional warrior who relied on overwhelming strength and conventional weapons. His fighting style was aggressive and direct with little regard for defense or tactical flexibility. The arena was established in the central plaza of the main colony, with thousands of Sarkonians and Vorthik watching from the surrounding buildings. Jake arrived precisely on time, carrying only basic weapons and wearing light armor that emphasized mobility over protection. His human appearance drew surprised reactions from many observers, who had expected something more physically imposing. Dolan entered the arena wearing full battle armor and carrying weapons designed for his superior size and strength. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never faced a serious challenge in personal combat. Jake noted the commander's equipment choices and tactical positioning while appearing relaxed and unconcerned about the obvious disadvantages he faced. Fight began with Dolan attempting to end it quickly through overwhelming force. He attacked with conventional tactics designed to use his superior reach and strength to press advantages that would crush any normal opponent. Jake responded with pure human unpredictability by giving ground when Dolan expected resistance, and attacking when the commander anticipated defensive moves. Every time Dolan thought he understood Jake's fighting style, the human changed tactics completely. Feints became real attacks. Defensive positions turned into aggressive advances. Jake used the arena environment as a weapon by maneuvering Dolan into obstacles and hazards that the commander had not considered. When Dolan grew frustrated and pressed harder, Jake became more elusive. When the commander tried to be more careful, Jake attacked with sudden fury. The turning point came when Jake used Dolan's own strength against him. The commander had prepared for the fight by having victory celebration decorations installed around the arena. Jake maneuvered the fight toward these preparations and caused Dolan to stumble into his own celebration platform. As the massive warrior fell, Jake delivered a precise strike that left his opponent unconscious but alive, a mercy shown to a defeated enemy. Shocked Sarkonian observers more than the victory itself. Their culture emphasized killing enemies in combat, and leaving an opponent alive was considered either weakness or supreme contempt. Jake's decision to spare Dolan, while obviously capable of killing him, sent a clear message about human values and capabilities. General Therian found himself bound by honor codes that he could not break without destroying his credibility as a military leader. The combat had been witnessed by thousands of people and broadcast throughout the galaxy. Sarkonian honor demanded that he respect the terms of the challenge, regardless of personal consequences. But Jake's real victory was not the fight itself, but what he revealed in its aftermath. Throughout his entire campaign, he had been recording everything and transmitting the data to news networks across the galaxy. The recordings showed not just his tactical successes, but documented Sarkonian brutality against the Vorthik people and their illegal mining operations on sacred ground. Public opinion throughout the galaxy shifted decisively against the Sarkonian Empire as the recordings spread through communication networks. The Galactic Council found itself under enormous pressure to take action against what was clearly an illegal occupation. Member species that had previously remained neutral began demanding sanctions against Sarkonia. Jake had accomplished more than just winning a planet. He had exposed Sarkonian aggression to galactic scrutiny and demonstrated that human capabilities were far greater than anyone had imagined. One person operating alone had defeated an entire military installation and forced a powerful empire to reconsider its policies. General Therian stood in his command center, watching the holographic displays that showed Sarkonian ships preparing for departure from Vortania Prime. The honor codes of his people left him no choice but to honor the terms of single combat even, though doing so meant abandoning a profitable mining operation and admitting defeat to a single human opponent. The recordings that Jake had broadcast throughout the galaxy made it impossible to deny what had happened or claim victory through alternative interpretations. The galactic response had been swift and devastating to Sarkonian interests. The Galactic Council had finally found the political courage to impose economic sanctions on the Sarkonian Empire after years of tolerating their aggressive expansion. Member species that had previously remained neutral were now demanding investigations into other Sarkonian-occupied territories. Trade agreements were being canceled and diplomatic relations severed as public opinion turned decisively against Sarkonian policies. Jake Morrison had accomplished something that entire fleets and diplomatic missions had failed to achieve. He had not only liberated Vortania Prime, but created a galactic movement that was challenging Sarkonian aggression throughout known space. The recordings of his campaign showed the galaxy that Sarkonian military superiority was largely an illusion based on overwhelming force rather than tactical brilliance. More importantly, Jake had demonstrated human capabilities in ways that could not be ignored or dismissed. Military strategists across the galaxy were studying his campaign and trying to understand how one person had defeated a supposedly impregnable installation. The psychological warfare techniques he had employed were being analyzed and discussed in military academies on dozens of worlds. The Vorthak people emerged from their containment camps as Sarkonian troops completed their evacuation procedures. Jake watched from a hilltop overlooking the main colony as families were reunited and the native population began reclaiming their ancestral lands. The crystal mining sites would need extensive restoration, but the Vorthak had their planet back and the resources to rebuild their society. Elder Thyax Vorthak approached Jake as he prepared to leave the planet and offered him permanent citizenship and a place of honor in their society. The gesture was deeply meaningful because the Vorthak rarely extended such recognition to outsiders. Jake accepted the crystal pendant they offered as a token of gratitude, but politely declined their offer of permanent residence. His work on Vortania Prime was finished, but there were other impossible missions waiting across the galaxy. Jake's reputation had grown far beyond simple mercenary work during the Vortania Prime campaign. News networks were calling him the human who took on a planet and won. Military contractors were studying his tactics and trying to recruit him for official positions. Political leaders were asking if humans might be reconsidered for peacekeeping operations given their demonstrated effectiveness against conventional military forces. The irony was not lost on Jake that the same Galactic Council that had banned humans from military service was now praising human ingenuity and tactical innovation. The recordings of his campaign had become required viewing in military training programs, and his psychological warfare techniques were being incorporated into standard tactical manuals. The galaxy was beginning to understand that human unpredictability was not a weakness, but a tremendous strategic advantage. Betty Chun arrived to pick up Jake exactly as scheduled in her freight ship, the Lucky Strike. She had followed the news coverage of his campaign with professional interest and was impressed by how completely he had outmaneuvered the Sarkonians. As they departed Vortania Prime, she asked Jake about his next assignment and was surprised to learn that he had not yet decided which contract to accept. Jake's communication console displayed dozens of offers from across the galaxy, ranging from simple bodyguard assignments to complex military operations that governments could not handle through official channels. Each contract offered substantial payment, and most presented challenges that would have been considered impossible before his Vortania Prime success. The galaxy had discovered that humans could accomplish things that other species considered beyond the realm of possibility. The most interesting offers came from liberation, movements on worlds under various forms of oppression. Word had spread through underground networks that there was a human who specialized in impossible missions and could defeat superior forces through unconventional tactics. Revolutionary groups that had given up hope were now requesting assistance from the human who had proven that determined individuals could change the course of galactic events. Jake studied the contract offers while the Lucky Strike traveled through hyperspace toward the frontier systems. Some missions involved rescuing political prisoners from maximum security facilities. Others required disrupting military operations or exposing corruption in planetary governments. All of them shared the common theme of requiring someone willing to take enormous risks for causes that conventional military forces could not support. A mission that caught Jake's attention involved a mining colony where corporate security forces were using slave labor and murdering workers who tried to organize resistance movements. The colonial government was controlled by corporate interests, and the Galactic Council refused to intervene because the corporation had significant political influence. Local resistance groups had been crushed repeatedly by superior firepower, and professional mercenaries. Jake accepted the contract with the same grin that had worried the Zephyrian trader back on Kepler 7 station. Another impossible mission that everyone said could not be accomplished. Another chance to prove that human determination and creativity could overcome any obstacle. Another opportunity to show the galaxy that one person with the right attitude could change everything. The success at Vertania Prime had established Jake as more than just a mercenary. He had become a symbol of human potential and a reminder that individuals could still make a difference in a galaxy dominated by massive institutions and overwhelming military forces. His story was inspiring other humans to push back against the artificial limitations that had been placed on their species. Morrison plotted a course for the Kepler frontier and began studying intelligence reports about his next target. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, there was always another planet that needed liberating and another impossible mission waiting for someone stubborn enough to accept it. The corporations and governments and military forces that thought their power was absolute were about to learn the same lesson that the Sarkonians had discovered on Vortania Prime. Never underestimate what one determined human can accomplish when everyone else says it cannot be done. Jake had proven that impossible was just another word for a challenge that required unconventional thinking and absolute refusal to accept defeat. The galaxy was full of bullies who had grown comfortable in their power and forgotten that someone always eventually comes along to prove that their strength is an illusion. Jake Morrison was that someone, and he was just getting started.